Good evening and welcome to the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas. My name is Maddie Zeller and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official organization of the Institute. I am a sophomore here at the University of Kansas, majoring in business management and leadership with a minor in political science. The Dole Institute of Politics strives to promote a new era of leadership that uses politics to bring people together through opportunities that emphasize bipartisan cooperation, public service, and civic education and engagement, all of which is inspired by the leadership and service of Senators Bob and Elizabeth Dole and the enduring civic contributions of the greatest generation. The Student Advisory Board is an integral part of this mission, providing members with experiential learning and job opportunities, access to financial assistance, and networking opportunities with our special guest. My involvement at the Dole Institute has opened doors to participate in civic engagement, as well as opportunities to educate myself on local, state, and national politics. This experience has encouraged me to pursue a career in public service, more specifically working in city management. I've had the opportunity to participate in some incredible events as a member of the Student Advisory Board, my favorite being last year's National Post-Election Conference. If you are a student here at KU and would like to join, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with a student worker after the program. Before we begin, there are a few reminders I'd like to take a moment to share with you. Following tonight's program, a video recording will be available to stream on demand on our YouTube channel, where you can access a full catalog of our past programming. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. The Institute also has a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. Please take a moment to familiarize yourselves with the marked exits in the room. In the event of an emergency, please make your way to the nearest marked exit. Please follow instructions of staff members and exit the building if necessary. Following tonight's interview, a limited number of audience questions will be answered. If you are a part of our virtual audience, you can submit questions via email at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute aims to foster civic and respectful engagement and discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your question with this in mind. Finally, I'd like to remind you to please silence your cell phones or place them in Do Not Disturb. Now please join me in welcoming Director Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you all for being with us this evening on this kind of dreary evening, but we're so glad to have the rain. So it's great to see you all, and thanks so much for joining us for tonight's program, Water for Our Future, a bipartisan conversation moderated by Dole Fellow Karen Willey with legislative members of the State Water Program Task Force. That would be Senator Kenny Titus and Representative Lindsay Vaughn. Titus and Vaughn serve as legislative members of the 16-member panel that was signed into law earlier this year. There are 7 legislative members and 9 non-legislative members. Before I turn it over to Karen to introduce our guests further and begin our conversation, I want to invite you back to the Dole Institute for a few more programs coming up. Our Fall Fellow for 2025 is Joni Wickham, probably best known for her service as Chief of Staff to former Kansas City, Missouri Mayor Sly James. She's a best-selling author and political consultant. She'll be here at the Dole Institute tomorrow to lead the second installment of her discussion group the series entitled Leadership Lessons from the Front Lines of Public Service. To her guest tomorrow, September 24th at 4 p.m. here at the Institute, Joni will be in conversation with the CEO of United Women's Empowerment, Wendy Doyle, who will be speaking about nonpartisan work her organization is doing to support women across Kansas in helping their communities and economies succeed. In a few weeks, we'll have another opportunity to discuss and listen in on a conversation with another bipartisan pair of Kansas legislators. Joni will be hosting a discussion on Wednesday, October 8th, again at 4 p.m. for her program, Bipartisan Consensus Building, Making Public Policy Work for Everyone. Joni will be in conversation with Kansas State Representatives Laura Williams and Brandon Woodard, who not only work together in the state legislature, but have the distinct honor of being former opponents, campaign opponents, and having run against one another. So that will be an interesting conversation. We'll hope to see you there. And then mark your calendars for Wednesday, October 22nd and November 12th for the 4th and 5th installments of Joni's discussion group. Now, before we've taken enough of your time, and I'm really excited to hand the floor over to Karen Willey to begin our conversation this evening. Please join me in welcoming Karen, Senator Titus, and Representative Vaughn.
Thank you all. So as this audience likely knows, water quality and quantity concerns are critical to the health of our people and land, our cities and our economy. Water in Kansas is owned by the state and regulated by the state, which calls for statewide leadership to help balance the needs of stakeholders across such a varied geography of local needs. It is an incredibly complicated task, and we're glad to have our guests with us. But as some of you know, about 1.5 years ago, I had the honor of interviewing these same guests at the Dole Institute. We talked about progress on water policy as part of a series on sustainability in Kansas in partnership with the Kansas Rural Center. Now, I'm very pleased to have our guests back for an update on their work. Please help me again and welcome Representative Lindsay Vaughn of Overland Park, House District 22, and then Representative, now Senator, Kenny Titus of Manhattan and Senate District 18. So in April of this year, the Kansas legislature passed a bill to create a new water program task force, and both of you were chosen to serve there, Senator Titus as co-chair. Can you tell us each about your personal background and how it relates to water policy, the work you've done?
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Thank you all for being here, especially on a rainy day, which does feel appropriate, but makes it logistically more challenging. So thanks for coming out. And thank you for the question. So I was first elected in 2020, and it was that first session in 2021 that I was appointed to the Water Committee. It had just been reformed, and I, growing up and just like hearing about the aquifer and knowing that it was running out, I had a personal interest in the Ogallala in particular, and also came from a family from a rural agricultural community and wanted to connect with more of that part of myself and my family. And their experience. And so knew I wanted to be on that committee, and it's been an amazing experience. I would say it's one of the most bipartisan committees that we have in the legislature, and I think that we have made tangible progress on a lot of different issues, and that has felt really amazing to be a part of. And also it's been an amazing opportunity to connect with communities across Kansas and the water issues that they're facing. So I loved being a part of it. We have done a lot in the past 5 years. Former Representative Ron Hyland was the chair, and he proposed what was called a mega water reform bill in 2022 that did a lot to address water management and funding in Kansas. That ultimately failed, but I think really moved the Overton window in terms of the conversation of water in Kansas and launched future discussions. That bill, part of that bill actually became House Bill 2279 that we passed in 2023, I believe. And that was a big step, in my opinion, towards ensuring that we have long-term strategic plans to address depletion of the Ogallala aquifer in Kansas. So that was great progress, and we've also made great progress on funding. So I think we've done a lot in just 5 years. The governor's office has also created a position for a special advisor on water. She's restarted the natural resources sub-cabinet on water, and I think from the gubernatorial side as well, really elevated the issue of water. So I think it's become a hot topic. It's been a hot topic, but I'm really excited about all the engagement right now in water, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about. So I appreciate being here tonight and being able to talk about it with you. So thank you.
Thank you. Senator?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Great Bend. When I was young, we had a farm around the Barton-Stafford County line. We had irrigated agriculture, lots of still some flood irrigation then from pipes and gates, and a little bit of center pivots as well. And then Great Bend is right in the middle of Cheyenne Bottoms and the Quivira Wildlife Refuge. So I kind of grew up around lots of different uses of water. I didn't get really interested in it or exposure to it until I got to law school, and I saw there was quite a bit of legal work that had been done around Cheyenne Bottoms in the early 90s. And I had to do a long paper for a class, and as I dug into that, I started seeing names I recognized and places that I had been to, and I found it really interesting and found water law interesting. After I graduated law school, then I worked, my first job was at the Department of Transportation, where I picked up a lot of property law, but I was able to move into the Attorney General's office, where I worked and represented the Kansas Water Office, so that's sort of the planning agency for the state. I was there for a relatively short time before I was recruited over to the Department of Agriculture, and that's where most of the work on regulating water quantity is. So I represented the chief engineer, and I was there for 6 years before I ran for office, and I had a lot of opportunities to see how water rights worked, how they were regulated, how they were enforced, and I also got to work on the legislative side for the department, and so some of those bills that were developed as we tweak laws, I had a hand in writing those. I was involved in some litigation over local enhanced management areas in western Kansas, which help reduce groundwater use. So I've kind of come up, the best place in Kansas to learn water law was at the Department of Ag, and was fortunate to spend 6 years there. And then when I was elected, I was on the House Water Committee with Representative Minix and Representative Vaughn. And now in the Senate, I'm on the Ag and Natural Resources Committee, where we touch some of those same issues.
So tell us about the basic timeline and purpose for the new task force.
So really the way I break it up is we were given 3 sort of legislative mandates. It's to identify the problems and the risks to our long-term supply of water. We need to consider what we need to do to address those risks, and then we need to pay for it. So pretty simple when you think about it, but it's a big task. There's a lot of different issues, but when you really dive into that, it's a little more complex because you have to take into consideration all the ways of public water supply. There's economic development questions answered, and so really kind of the focus, I think, is where we'll end up is our water planning system was more or less put in place late 60s, early 70s, and it's been pieced together over time since then. Some things have improved and tweaked, but the way we plan for water projects and look at things hasn't really changed a lot over the years. And so I think as we talk about putting more money into water and it gets more attention, the real focus has to be on how do we create a system where we're comfortable putting more money into it because we know it's accountable and we're actually achieving results and sort of meeting metrics. And that's not the way the system was originally designed. They do some of that now, but it's really not in the structure. So we'll be looking at that, and we'll have a preliminary report coming up here in January, hopefully, and then we'll have another year to come up with a final report to make recommendations on all of those things.
Anything to add to that?
I think that it's a really great opportunity right now because there's been such an issue with chronic underfunding of water and natural resources in Kansas for a long time. You know, the statutory requirement was only $8 million a year for the state water plan fund, and that was even not fully funded for, I think it was like 10 years. So we've had chronic underfunding. There's kind of been this piecemeal effort to try and put together these planning efforts, and I think our agency folks do a great job. All the water advocates in the state do a great job. And we have this opportunity now to kind of look at it from a strategic and systemic way to say, okay, we know we need to increase investment. We know we've chronically underfunded water in Kansas. How do we overhaul it in a way that allows us to really get the most out of our programs, to best support staff, to make the biggest impact on this issue? So I think looking at it from a planning perspective, potentially, I hope a reorganization perspective, and also a funding perspective, which I think is the conversation we have the most of, just even since, I'm trying to think back, for decades, we've been talking about how we need more funding in water. We had the 2017 Blue Ribbon Task Force that said we needed to invest, I think in today's dollars, $60 million a year, which has since been updated. And we just had the strategic planning process that took place where they're saying to really make a difference, it needs to be $140 million a year. So I think that's my hope, is that ultimately we're working towards how do we identify strategically what needs to be funded, and then how do we do that and come up with a sustainable funding source to make sure that happens into the future.
So you both touched on this a little bit, but I want to dive in a little. How does this new task force differ from all the ways that the state currently talks about water? We have, you both mentioned the Senate and House Water Committees, the Kansas Water Office, Kansas Water Authority, Department of Water Resources, Water Plan, Department of Ag. How is this different, and how does this move the needle?
I guess I can take first stab. So I think all of those pieces play a really important part. I think the benefit of a task force from the legislative perspective is that we can focus on one issue, and then spend our time kind of making recommendations that then come out of that task force. So as we're looking at a long-term strategic plan for how do we organize water agencies, how do we implement the best water programs, and then how do we fund it? I think, when we're in water committee, and I'm sure it's the same on the Senate side too, you hear from agencies and you're getting so much information throughout the year, but I think this task force allows us to really focus on finding a solution to this issue. And so I think that's the benefit and how it differs a little bit. And then the recommendations that we make, they'll have to go through those entities. So we may make recommendations to the Water Authority, or we may propose bills that go to the House and to the Senate, or perhaps there's some kind of executive action, but it allows us to focus on this issue in particular.
I think the key thing the task force will do is really refocus that planning process, because each of the agencies and the different groups that make recommendations now, over time, they become a little bit siloed. You've got your folks that really care about conservation practices and your water quality practices, and sometimes they get together and talk and cooperate. And there's overlap in those areas where they cooperate, and it's not to suggest they're not working well together, but just when you look at those long-term strategies and approaches, it's so dependent on having a governor that understands how water works, which hasn't necessarily been the case over history. Then they have to appoint agency heads that also understand how water work, and then those people have to have the people at each agency, they have to sort of encourage them to talk to one another, right? Your normal bureaucratic problems. And I was in that system, and you really have to work hard to get out of your agency and talk to other people. And even when we do it really well for a period of time, those leadership changes, and then some of that kind of atrophy. And so it's just the way our system was set up. And so this allows us to take a holistic look, is maybe the right way to describe it, and say, are we doing this the right way? Is what we've done over the last 30 years, what have we actually accomplished, and are we moving the needle on the things that are problems, or the problems we've missed? How are we identifying those problems? And I think what we'll be able to do is set that framework, and the agencies and some of those folks, their job will really be to implement those things. And I think we can sort of reset that framework and let them focus on what they're best at, and that's sort of carrying out those directives rather than having to work within a system that doesn't fit their needs and trying to piecemeal that together.
So we're also checking in on some of the legislation that you were both key to in 2023 that helped better fund the water plan. One focus of that work was to open a grant program for municipalities for infrastructure and technical assistance. What have we learned about the scope of the need there, and are there any successes and challenges you want to share?
Yeah, I think we've learned that municipalities will apply for money when it's offered for free. Because if you look at the numbers, right, the number of, we had put $12 million for projects and about $5 million for technical assistance, and I think over the last couple of years that there was a couple of million extra put into those pots, and the application pools were much bigger than that. What I think has been interesting, though, is the type of projects that have sort of floated to the top, and I think we as the legislature have to really, and some of this was an experiment to see, where can we make the biggest impact? What do we need? But I think we have to really focus in as a legislative body and say, well, what types of projects is it important to fund? Where do we need to focus our money? Because we're never going to be able to pay for all the projects out of the state general fund. There's too much need. And, some projects, the impact is a lot greater. You can look at, there's one project, it was a small town, they helped with some infrastructure, but it ends up being from the state $10,000 per capita. Those are just not sustainable projects, right? And the odds, there'll be no economic development off of that or anything like that. So we have to really look at these projects. That would be the biggest concern, is we need to make sure we have the right criteria in place and that we're spending those dollars wisely, because we won't be able to cover it all. But I think we've learned with some of the things like the technical assistance, we can really get folks out there and move the needle and help communities go find other dollars as well. So it's got to be a collaborative approach, but I think we're still learning. And then there have been some great projects as well. Lindsay can probably talk about some of those, but we know it's made a positive impact for sure.
Yeah, I think so. I did write down the numbers before I came tonight. So we did get an annual report from the Water Office, and they talked about the total amount of funding requests they received and then what they were actually able to fund, both in fiscal year 24 and 25. So we know there is a huge need across the state. And in 2024, there were $380 million in total requests from small municipalities for public and wastewater supply improvements to their infrastructure. And only $18 million of that was available to actually fund in 2024. And then it was $227 million in requests in 2025 and $27 million available to fund in 2025. So we know there's a huge need. We know it makes a difference. And I would agree with Senator Titus. I think we have to be strategic about how we're administering those funds in the future. And I think a couple of opportunities are there. I think looking at regionalization is important. I think that's something that, there's been some resistance to in the past, but an increasing awareness that it can be an asset for communities. We see like Caney, Kansas, many of you probably saw this summer, literally ran out of water. And they had to bring in water bottles and find ways to kind of come up with temporary solutions. And I think, they're going to connect their water supply to Deerfield, Kansas now. And so I think finding these opportunities where we can connect communities and their water supply could be a big advantage as we look to the future for providing clean and reliable water across Kansas. And then I think the funding question is also a piece of this. And I think there's a lot we can do with state general funds. I think it's important we do that. But another model that we've started to talk about on the task force is this idea of creating a state-level revolving loan fund, so that, and it's something that currently exists at the federal level, but it's a loan fund for these types of projects that has low-interest loans for communities. So, instead of just a grant fund, they would be able to apply to get a low-interest loan to implement these projects, to supplement state funding or to use that instead. So I think we can get creative with funding models, and we can look at regionalization, but we know that there's a big need for this. And we've seen that both with the bill that was passed, and we've heard that in testimony on the task force too, from Kansas municipal utilities and these communities that have contamination issues with nitrogen and uranium in parts of the state, and their water quality is decreasing, and we need to find ways to help them have safe drinking water. But per capita, it doesn't always make sense to put in a $6 million nanofiltration system like they did in Lincoln, Kansas, for example. So how do we make sure they still have clean drinking water? And I think that's going to be a big challenge for the future of Kansas and for our task force as well.
Kansas has 24 federal reservoirs that provide, flood control, water supply, recreation, and wildlife habitat. And for these artificial lakes, we always knew that siltation was going to be, an anticipated issue with them. But some of the reservoirs have been filling up faster than others. Can you give us an update on just two of those, which you probably know which ones I'm going to ask about? John Redmond Reservoir, which is the source for cooling water for Wolf Creek. We had a big dredging project in 2016. What have we seen and what have we learned from that project? And I'll start with the representative. That's right.
Okay. Yeah. I can take Wolf Creek and John Redmond. So John Redmond was manually dredged a number of years back. I don't remember exactly when. And we just finished paying off that contract, which was extremely expensive because you have to find a way to remove the sediment, and then you have to find somewhere to actually put the sediment. And it was billions of dollars, I want to say.
I think it was at 20 million.
20 million.
20 million, okay, not quite that expensive, just in my mind.
It's a lot.
But yes, it's a lot of money. And the key problem is that it's not sustainable. You know, the reservoir is already filling back in with sediment. We know it's going to be a problem again. So I think the question and kind of what we're exploring at Tuttle Creek, which I'll pass the baton, is how do we have sustainable sediment management and sustainable long-term dredging projects, not just one-time dredging projects. So, and that's something we're seeing at Tuttle, which is an exciting pilot.
Yeah, and so I'm familiar with Tuttle Creek, so it's right on the border of my district between Riley and Pottawatomie counties. But what they're trying there is they've actually got a barge out on the lake, and they've built special equipment that will send high pressure streams of water down to the bottom, and it'll stir up the sediment. And what they're doing is the way that dam was built, it has lower gates under the water, and so they can open those channels, and it essentially creates an undercurrent. And the idea is you stir up the sediment that's captured, it'll catch in the current and create a natural flow, and it'll flow out downstream like it would have if the dam wasn't there in the first place. So, and the way I understand the physics of it, if there was more elevation change from the front to the back into the reservoir, that would happen naturally in some places, but Tuttle Creek is a relatively flat area, so you have to sort of create that channel and help it move. So they're trying that out. I believe they're doing a 3-season test run, so they just started last week. They'll do 10 days now, 10 days in the spring, and 10 days in the summer with the new equipment. And the state and the Corps of Engineers are partnering on that. And the main thing they're doing now is to see how much sediment they can move. And then there's some biological testing downstream because of the dam, the Blue River between the exit point into the Blue at Tuttle Creek down to the Kansas River has become very clean, clear water for a prairie stream, which wasn't the case naturally. So the ecosystem has changed, and now we're reintroducing turbidity to it. So they think it'll actually be a benefit to some of the native species to come back upstream a little bit because it hasn't been the case. But they'll do there's a lot of eyes watching it. It's the first time this has ever been tested in an inland reservoir. It's usually done in coastal areas with the injection dredging model. So the key difference, though, is when you dredge like at John Redmond, you have to actually put the sediment somewhere. And in that case, they piped it out, and then it had to dry out in fields before it could be repurposed for something else. And there's a tremendous cost to that, not in just in the physical energy to move material, but then you have to lease land in order to let the material dry out. So if you can manage sediment without pulling it out of the water system, there's big savings there. And so if this is successful, it will not work at every reservoir because the gate level isn't the same on every engineering design. Perry, to the north of here, is an area that also has gates at that level that would benefit. But they have some other ideas with hydrosuction that they could combine this with that we've been working with to see what works. So they're trying to find the most cost-efficient model to move sedimentation so that we don't have to essentially drain the reservoir, clean it back out, and fill it back up again. So,
and the purpose of that is to learn. It's not necessarily to dredge the entire of Tuttle Creek Reservoir at this point.
Correct. We've funded with us and the federal government. We've funded this. It's called a pilot project, and so I would suspect if it's successful, we would be looking at how to implement it full time. I think about 40% of Kansans depend on Tuttle Creek and the Kansas River for their water supply. So, and not quite half of that has been the storage capacity has disappeared since it was opened. So, it's a real priority to get some progress there.
Can you cast any light on the state of our other reservoirs? Are they close behind this, or do we have some time to learn on these first two?
The Water Office has a wonderful presentation on this, but it varies based on a number of things. You know, the stream and the amount of area above the dam makes a huge difference. Some streams are dirtier than others. You know, Cheney Reservoir down by Wichita 30 or 40 years ago made a real effort to work on upstream management practices, and they're still at something like 85%. I might be off on that, but it's an incredibly high number of storage still available in Cheney because they were really proactive really early, and you get a little help with your natural geography, but the numbers vary. Tuttle is the worst, Cheney's probably the best, and everything else falls somewhere in between. They've lost 10% of storage up to that upper 40%, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So for Western Kansas, depletion of the high plains or Oglala Aquifer has been a top concern for decades. We have 5 groundwater management districts, and they were established, I think, back in the 70s. Is that right? But as part of the 2023 legislation that you both worked on, these local boards were tasked with a timeline for producing action plans and addressing, having a local board that addresses local issues. And I think they have to report back by next year. So can each of you share just one story from each of them? I know we won't have time to dive into all.
Yeah.
You want to start?
I'll start. Yeah. So just a little bit of additional context. This was really exciting. So all of the districts, the groundwater management districts, are required to have a management plan, but there was nothing in law prior to this that required them to essentially have a long-term strategic plan to address depletion. So essentially, like this requires that they have meaningful conservation plans, which has never existed before. So it is a big deal. And we have some districts that are already doing a great job. GMDs 1 and 4 have already instituted what Senator Titus alluded to. They're called local enhanced management areas, where in both cases, these are district-wide agreements where the producers, along with the district, create a plan that they overall will use less water in exchange for some flexibilities. But overall, they're reducing their total water use. So those districts have been doing a great job and really leading the way on this. And then some of the other districts have not been doing as great of a job historically. But I'm really excited to say I think that's changing. So I guess the anecdote I would share is maybe from GMD 3, and we did receive an update from them at our latest task force meeting. GMD 3 is the most southwestern part of the state. There was a book written about them called Running Out not that long ago that kind of just talked about really the lack of comprehensive conservation strategies and, I think the lack of leadership to try and get something done to save the aquifer and just the politics that were at play with that. And, since this bill passed, there's been a change of leadership on the board. And when they came to present to us, I was impressed with where the conversation was going. And some of the notes that I had taken, they, as part of this bill, they're required to do local outreach meetings and talk to the producers in their area about what do they want to see happen, what are their goals with reducing aquifer use. And the consensus was that the entire district, for those who've been surveyed, want to move towards sustainability. So sustainable aquifer use in the next 5 to 25 years, which just 5 years ago would have been unheard of for this district. So they've set that goal, which I think is, it's ambitious, but I think is incredible. And then for their action plan that they're putting together, they have said they want to create a draft of that by March of 2026, and that they intend to do some kind of, if not district-wide, substantial LEMA. So that is a huge shift in where the conversation was from mostly excuses, failed LEMAs, I think politics getting in the way of progress, and shifting towards, I really think, a culture of, realizing that this bill has passed, it's time to do something, how can we all come together and do something that's meaningful? So of course, proof is in the pudding. I'm excited to see what they actually come up with, but that has been a huge shift in the dialogue, and I was excited to hear that on the task force.
Yeah, thank you. Senator?
Yeah, I'm also really optimistic with the work of the groundwater management districts. We saw a substantial movement since the bill's passed. The boards of those entities have done a good job. They've taken the charge seriously. And we set an important metric, I think, before them, because they had sort of a vague task about conserving groundwater in statute before, but we pretty plainly said if you have less than 50 years of usable life left, you need to be working on this. And we understand you're not going to stop all depletions tomorrow, but if you've got this much water left, you need to really be talking about what you want that future to look like. And I think by getting folks to sit down and have that conversation and sort of demanding that they solve it rather than us say, we see the problem and here's the solution, right? It's bottom-up solutions, and we're seeing good progress. An example of that I didn't necessarily anticipate from the bill was you look at GMD 5, which is South Central Kansas, and they have an area, their water levels are more stable, they get more rain, their soil's sandier, so they actually get some recharge, unlike farther out west. But because the water can move more easily through those sandy soils, they have water quality problems. The nitrates are a much bigger issue there than other parts of the state. And they identified that in their plan, and we had some substantial conversation at our last task force meeting about what do we do for our public water supplies? Should we be tracking nitrates all across the district? And those are conversations that we were not have. They were there, but they weren't serious conversations a couple years ago. And so there's been a lot of positive things that I didn't even think we would get to that are now coming to the surface. So I think we're making really good progress in Western Kansas.
And if I can add, I think the other important piece of the bill is that I think we all agreed that the best solutions are going to come from people who are on the ground and from these local stakeholder groups in the groundwater management districts. But I think the important piece here is that there's also an accountability backstop. So if the districts fail to come up with a plan that reasonably addresses the issue, whether it's quality or quantity, then the chief engineer will develop a plan for them to reasonably address the problem. So I think that's also kind of been a good kick in the behind, for them to take this process seriously and to come up with meaningful plans to address their biggest areas of concern. And I felt better about the bill knowing that accountability backstop is there as well to ensure that this gets done either way.
Senator, you mentioned nitrates in drinking water, and that's both a groundwater issue and a surface water issue. Can either of you talk on the causes and risks for that, for nitrates?
Well, it's primarily from fertilizer for agricultural uses and runoff and things like that. A lot of it's long-standing, there's historical uses, farming practices have changed, and I don't know that we always have a great handle on it until it shows up, in a water quality test somewhere. The real problem, I guess, in dealing with that is almost all of that pollution is non-point source pollution. So if you get deep into the water quality laws, it's not a source that can be direct. The federal government can't regulate it. Theoretically, states could, but typically that's a very heavy-handed regulation on every agricultural use. So you have to be mindful of that. And so it's a difficult problem because you can't just point your finger and solve it. It's not like a factory that's polluting and you just say whatever you emit into the stream has to meet certain levels, or, like we do with wastewater facilities, because it's not just coming from one point. It's all of these cumulative farms all the way up a river basin that causes this, or as it seeps into groundwater, it's the same sort of thing. So it's a real issue, and I think it's a big discussion to lean into how to solve that for sure.
Yeah, so I am excited that the task force has been talking about this because I think it's both an issue now and it's only going to get worse. And I think that we need to start doing something about it from a statewide perspective. And there's some interesting things happening in Nebraska right now along these lines. So their natural resource boards, which are somewhat similar to the groundwater management boards that we've alluded to, now are collecting data voluntarily from producers to create a data dashboard so they can see from a statewide perspective how much nitrogen is being applied to land. And then they also are running a nitrogen reduction incentive program to incentivize producers to use less nitrogen on their land. So I think there are models for things that we can do to reduce nitrogen use. And something that I thought was really interesting that Senator Titus kind of mentioned on the task force was just, we have these action plans for water quality and quantity, but what if we did something similar where the groundwater management districts come up with plans to reduce their nitrogen use in their districts, for example. So that could be a potential solution. But I think we need to get a better handle on what is the scale of the problem and what are we going to do about it. And then also, how do we inform the public of the risks? Because I think, we know blue baby syndrome is a big risk of increased nitrogen consumption. Cancer is an increased risk of increased nitrogen consumption. So I think also informing the public health of, how much nitrogen they are consuming and what the risks of that are an important piece of this as well.
And it's one conversation for municipalities, which probably many of those technical assistance requests were for that, but also for household wells. Can you talk about, is there any role for the state in regulating or even monitoring household wells?
So I can start there. Previously, there's been a lot of resistance to any kind of regulation of private wells. I think there has been an increasing interest in voluntary testing of private wells, especially with the increase in uranium and water in parts of western Kansas. People have started to want to know what levels of contaminants they have in their groundwater supply. So I believe it wouldn't have made it ultimately into the budget, but we had another funding bill this last year that would have increased funding by a certain amount. And in there was a requirement that part of that funding go towards having KDHE offer free testing to well owners across Kansas. And I don't think that ultimately passed, but I think that's a model for something we could do where we could offer free testing, have people test it, and then potentially share their data anonymously so that we can get a better picture overall about the quality of water in private wells across the state. So I think there are potentials to make progress there. I don't think right now there's a will to completely regulate private wells.
So along with, there's other kinds of conservation practices in farming. You mentioned about limiting nitrate use and fertilizer use, but beyond that we've got soil health practices that can help reduce erosion and boost infiltration, changing irrigation tactics. But those culture changes are really hard, and our farmers are strapped. And how are these farming practices part of the conversation from the task force?
That's a good question.
My initial answer is that probably is a little bit beyond the direct mandate of the task force. We certainly have a lot of programs, conservation programs in place, and riparian buffer strips, and right, the state is doing all those things, but they're all the voluntary programs, and like you said, it takes a while to build those up. I don't know that conversation will shift. I think our role is probably to clearly identify the problem and educate, and our task force's job isn't necessarily to solve every problem. It's to say, these are the problems, these are the tools now, and the way you need to go solve the problem, because legislators try to solve every problem, but seldom do.
I guess I would maybe give a partial answer. I think that land practices and producer input have been part of the process throughout. So, I think we're looking at it more from a 30,000-foot view, but we've been relying on the feedback of producers, to pass House Bill 2279 and make that workable. When we're having the nitrate conversation, I think that's inherent in that. How do we get producer buy-in to reduce nitrogen contamination in our groundwater supply? And I think another thing that I think is exciting is we've started or had a federal grant that's in limbo, unfortunately now, but for a High Plains partnership with the groundwater management districts where we would essentially be funding staff for these districts to hire basically auditors is what I would call them, but folks who have the expertise to go out and look at producers' irrigation systems and see where they can increase efficiencies in order to decrease their aquifer use. And this has been done on a small scale in GMD5, and they've seen, with just that level of improvement, you can see a 10 to 15% reduction in water use. And so I think programs like that, where we can get local producers involved, that's more related to reduction in aquifer use versus talking about like soil health practices. But I think it applies there too. Like, how can we engage them through some of this work that we're doing? So I think it's inherent. We're taking kind of a look at it from more of a 30,000-foot view.
Okay. So industry and wildlife are also stakeholders in the water conversation. Do those get the same amount of attention as municipalities and agriculture?
We haven't had enough meetings yet to say for sure. They do have a strong presence, and I think they'll get their piece in the due course of discussion, but it historically hasn't necessarily been the focus of these sort of task groups, so we'll see where our committee takes us.
I would say in terms of representation on the task force, I think there is a good mix. In terms of industry, Evergy has an appointment to the board. In terms of wildlife, Heidi Mell, who is amazing and is a district director for the Nature Conservancy, she's on our task force. Josh Swati, who is involved with Kansas Municipal Utilities, but is also a producer and has been involved in some water conservation. He is a part of the board. So I think in terms of representation, we have a good mix. And I think in terms of use, it's just because agriculture and municipalities are the largest users of water across the state that I think they tend to be the most represented. But I think, at least in composition of the task force, those other voices are present as well.
Okay. So 2026 will be an election year for the governor and also for all of the House. What progress do you hope to see in the next legislative cycle, and recognize that it also corresponds with the timing of your task force?
I think that the important thing will be, there'll be, a new governor comes in year one with a lot of optimism and a lot of energy coming off winning an election, and whoever that ends up being. I think our goal will be to provide a framework of bills and a plan that says this is what we think the way forward is, and I think it'll be a good moment to carry that momentum with the new administration and start working with them on water right from the get-go. So I think we'll have a good opportunity. I think the timing will end up being good, and I'm optimistic that we'll have folks in place that'll carry forward our agenda. So.
Yeah, I think in terms of the upcoming legislative session, I have mixed feelings about it because I'm generally under the impression that House and Senate leadership want to keep the session very short. There are members on the leadership teams who are running for statewide office, and my inclination or my perception is that they want to get out so they can run their races. So I think that we're going to have a fairly short session, which could not work in our favor, but I do believe right now we have a Governor Kelly, who's been an awesome ally for water in Kansas. She's really, I think, put a spotlight on this and been a good advocate and an ally in terms of the funding bills and a lot of the legislation that we've been discussing. And, she has said that she's willing to spend her political capital to get more done on water and to have a long-term vision and strategy for water in Kansas. So I think there's interest in all levels right now, from the House to the Senate to the executive branch, and great folks in our agencies as well. I think there is great momentum to get something done. And now that we have the task force that can, I think, put forward a proposal for everyone to consider, I think all of that does have the opportunity to coalesce and for something meaningful to get done. I just worry about potential time constraints.
So I'm going to ask a final question. We're going to turn to the audience after that. But how can the public, and especially this public, meaningfully keep up with the work that's being done and also engage with it? So opportunities for them to participate.
We do stream all of our meetings the same way every legislative meeting has been streamed, so it's easy to follow along, and some of those are long meetings, so you can skim through the closed captions as you go. But we've made as co-chair and as my other co-chair, Representative Jim Minix from Scott City, we've made it a point to allow public comment at all the meetings as we move through the phases, and we encourage that. And so we want to make sure the public has opportunities to weigh in as we move through this process. And so just kind of keeping an eye. And as we get further in the process, so some of these first meetings, these first set has really been focused on, there's sort of a base level of information you have to get out there so you can really get a full grasp on the problem you're dealing with. And, you know, I think as we start to talk more in depth at the next couple meetings about how we do things and our systems and what other states are doing for best practices, I think there'll be more opportunities for meaningful contributions from the public as we start talking about what that future system will look like.
Yeah, I would agree. I think kind of keeping an eye on the task force, and I believe we could share the information for the committee assistant, but that way, for folks who are interested, you can kind of receive updates about what our agenda is, when we're going to be meeting, you know, how to testify or provide public comment. And then, like Senator Titus said, I think, you know, we're evaluating the problem right now, and I think when we kind of work towards what solutions do we want to pursue, what legislation do we want to pursue, that's an awesome opportunity for the public to voice their feedback and testify and give their input on what they think are good solutions and not good solutions. And then same goes for the legislative session. I also always encourage folks the committee assistant kind of has a listserv, so every time that we have a new agenda for the committee or we have a hearing for the committee, they send that information out to the listserv, and that's a good way to stay in the loop on what's happening in Water Committee and then the Senate Ag and Natural Resources Committee as well. But definitely love public engagement, so please testify, please let us know the things that you support and what you want to see more of, because it's a big challenge, and I think, you know, we come up with the best solutions together. So would love your feedback.
All right, and now we'll do that. So we have two students that are going to come around with microphones. So raise your hand if you have a question and wait for a student to come around. We've got a few up here. I think the second row came up first.
Thank you for presenting. I really learned a lot. And I know the Oglala Aquifer has been a real issue for a number of years. But I also believe that eastern Kansas is kind of in jeopardy as well. And can you talk about what are the issues with water for the eastern part of the state?
Sure.
And what's being done?
Yeah, and you're right. There really are, when you look at these sort of issues, there really are two fundamental issues when we talk about water in Kansas because of the hydrology and the weather. You know, it's groundwater declines in the west, and it's, you know, reservoir sedimentation in the east. And so most of our systems, there's groundwater in eastern Kansas, but most of our public water supply systems from Junction City and all the way through Johnson, Wyandotte County, they're going to be surface water fed, and that's especially true in southeast Kansas. They have less groundwater down there, and their systems, the reservoirs are smaller, and when it dries up fast, and there can be some real issues there. So our top priority in the east is making sure we preserve that reservoir capacity over the long term. Now, the piece that's sort of intertwined with that when we talk about quality, you know, and surface water, it's got to be some of those conservation practices to worry about nitrates and whatever else might be getting in. We have to keep that water clean, but making sure we have enough water and we can store enough, because if we don't do that, our communities and our industry, we won't be able to grow, and so we have to be mindful of that. So protecting our reservoirs in the east is really the top priority.
Yeah. Representative, other urban issues?
Yeah, just briefly, I think those are the big water quantity challenges. I think the other challenge that we have in the eastern part of the state is water quality. So, you know, we predominantly rely on surface water. So the quality of that water supply is also, you know, there are challenges with that. And then in urban communities, we have urban runoff. And then really the new frontier is PFAS. So regulating PFAS and
You'll have to explain PFAS.
how we're okay, let's see if I don't even know if I can remember the entire acronym.
Just the forever chemicals, I
yes,
think.
forever chemicals, thank you. So it's a newly regulated chemical from the EPA, and I should know more about this. It's kind of an emerging issue, but they just came out with regulations. I'm not certain on the timeline of when municipalities have to come into compliance with those regulations, but it's an emerging issue because it is challenging to get out of the water supply, but it's also important to do so. They have found a lot of links with cancer and other major health issues with accumulated PFAS. So I think it's really important that we do it. That's something that we predominantly see in the eastern part of the state because it's largely associated with industrial discharge. And I'm not the expert, but it's PFAS is, I think it's like a water retardant chemical, and so you see it a lot with like fire stations. I think it is seen with dry cleaners, if I'm not mistaken, and then also military operations or bases. They're kind of concentrated in those areas. So it's not an issue everywhere, but there are certain hotspots in Kansas, and that's going to be an issue in the eastern part that I think we're going to have to focus on in the coming years.
All right, thank you both. We have a question up at the front, and then we'll move over here.
The large Panasonic plant that's going to be or is under construction over by whatever, they are obviously going to use a lot of water, and they're going to discharge a lot of water. Are they going to be in any kind of regulation as to the quality of the water they discharge, or are they just going to dump whatever?
Yeah, they're subject to the same laws. That would be a point source pollution. So they would fall under the Clean Water Act as a discharger, and they'll have to meet the same standards that whatever the wastewater plants along the Kansas, if they're discharging into the river. So they'll have to meet the same discharge regulations as anybody else. I would have to double check this, but I believe that they actually are taking their water from the city of DeSoto, and they've worked with the city of DeSoto. They have water rights there, and all of it's within the quantities. It's all manageable. That area is actually, I don't believe, closed to appropriations yet, so there's plenty of water available. So they don't anticipate any trouble with Panasonic as far as using up too much water or extra pollution. That is already a heavily polluted area because of the Army ammunition plant that was there as well. So my understanding is they had to do quite a bit of cleanup in order to build out there in the first place. So,
We had a question in the second row here.
How exactly does the new task force work with existing legislative structures like the KWA and KWO and chief engineer and all that?
So essentially we'll be making recommendations to those entities. So we're kind of studying this, how do we improve long-term strategic planning and organization of our government, and then in order to do that, that'll mean introducing bills to the House and the Senate. That might mean, for example, asking the Water Authority to update or make recommendations on updating our regulations around minimum stream flows. They can make recommendations, and then from the agency side, we may make requests of them for certain information or for certain programs or projects, but kind of our job will be to study the issue and then to kind of delegate to the existing entities to help support those recommendations.
And they're integrated into the process because the chief engineer, the director of the water office, and the director of environment have seats on the task force. So that they're participating members, and when we get presentations about the state of things in Kansas, they're typically the ones bringing us that information because they're the ones working in the field. So
working past the silos.
Right, absolutely.
Okay, we have other questions. We have one in the third row here in the aisle.
Hi, thank you both for your contributions. And I was wondering, how is the task force balancing more immediate demands for water with longer-term sustainability goals?
That's a great question. So I think, we're largely focused on the bigger picture. So the longer term sustainability goals, as you mentioned. So like, for example, last year, there was a strategic planning process that happened across Kansas, and they looked at how do we create a 10-year framework. So I think that's kind of a balance of short-term and long-term. It included a 2-year ramp up and then a 10-year framework for, how do we come up with all these projects, evaluate them, and implement them, and how much will that cost? So I think, we will, I think we have a similar goal in that sense of how do we develop a strategic plan, looking at long-term needs, but I mean, a lot of the things that we're doing now, I think, are aimed at shorter-term needs as well, like the grant funding for municipalities, like conservation plans for groundwater management districts. I'm trying to think of some of the other types of things, but I do think it's a good mix. But I think our goal overall as a task force is kind of the longer-term vision.
I think the task force is focused on longer term. I would say if you really look at what we've been doing as a state, most of our work has been responding to short-term needs. Some of that in years because of a lack of funding and some other reasons. So it's not that there hasn't been long-term work done. I don't think we've done much to implement long-term work because of restraints on the system, because we're mostly responding to short-term needs would be kind of how I'd frame that. So we're trying to pull ourselves out of that responding, even the infrastructure. It was a problem 20 years ago, but we didn't really do anything about it, or no one did anything about it, and now it's an immediate need instead of a long-term need. So
yeah. I feel my sense is that there's been so much chronic underfunding, it's just been about putting out fires, and now that we have this coalition of people who are bought into, okay, we need to take this problem seriously and we need to invest in it, we now have this opportunity to kind of take a step back and say, how do we do that strategically, and how do we get the buy-in we need to implement that and fund it?
We had a question. Was it the fourth row on this side? Yes, here you go.
Thank you very much for your presentation tonight. Really informative, interesting. I was just curious if your task force or the water management boards out in the state are looking into like land management to offset some of the sedimentation, or even like a beneficial reuse of wastewater for some of the Ogallala recharging.
The short answer is yeah. I mean, all of that's being worked on to varying degrees, but it's there are several municipalities, Garden City and Dodge City are looking at reuse. Wichita's looking at reuse as well. So Kansas is maybe behind some other western states, but it's because the need in Arizona, New Mexico, there's a much more dire need for that water, and so we haven't necessarily been driven to look at that because it takes all new infrastructure. So we're moving that direction in some of those areas, and then yeah, the land practices are, it's education, it's voluntary, and we have areas of emphasis where we sort of funnel those resources, but it's still a voluntary process. It just takes time.
Just to quickly add, I think on the other question of, studying or incentivizing best management practices above reservoirs, I think, at least to my knowledge, a lot of that's mostly been done for water quality. So more precision application of fertilizers, no-till, things like that to prevent runoff, to prevent harmful algal blooms. I think it sounds like some of that was also done at Cheney to prevent sedimentation flowing into the rivers. But I do know the Army Corps of Engineers also just did a study to identify the source of the sediment that is flowing into the reservoirs, which has been interesting. I think that just got published. So we're starting to get some of that data about where the sediment's coming from, I think, to maybe help us better come up with a solution to both manage the sediment that's in there and then hopefully prevent more of the sediment from flowing into the reservoirs.
We had the striped shirt back here.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understood. Are you saying that the current level of spending on water is adequate? And if not, how do you anticipate funding being increased, considering the legislature kind of opinion on spending and kind of the unusual tax proposals that have been coming out here recently?
Wow, did someone plant this question? I love it.
Take it away.
No, I do not think the funding level currently is adequate. I think we have made progress. Like I said previously, the statutory requirement was $8 million. With the bill that was passed in 2023, I think also that increased it. It was the $8 million plus an additional $35 million a year. And then there have been some enhancements since then. So I think this past legislative cycle, it was around 53 million, if I'm not mistaken, about there. And I still think we're at the point of putting out fires. You know, we see the need in small town municipalities for improving their public water supply systems and their wastewater systems, among other things. And based on the funding recommendations that were made by the Strategic Planning Committee that was put together last year, their recommendation in order to make progress from where we are now would be $140 million a year. So yeah, we're not even close to that yet. In terms of where that's going to come from, it's a great question. I think we've built a lot of support to increase funding, but I think if we're going to I think the issue with that is that it's always susceptible to legislative sweeps. So if we lose momentum, then the next legislature can just decide that they don't want to fund water anymore. And so our challenge is to come up with a sustainable funding source. And what the Blue Ribbon Task Force came up with in 2017 was a sales tax carve-off, which is what they've done in Missouri, actually. And that's a sales tax carve-off that the voters reapprove every 10 years. And that goes to water and conservation. So it's for public lands and parks and things like that as well. But you know, that's an option that's been discussed. I would personally love to legalize weed and then use profit from that to fund water programs and projects. But I think we're going to have to get creative with whatever source we use. You know,
I'm not quite so sure I jumped to the answer of are we spending enough money. I don't know, because the piece Representative Vaughn left out is there is about $20 million in fees that are collected from livestock users and municipalities, and so that's where you get it. It's about, with the $8 million from SGF that was supposed to be transferred, it was about $30 million a year is what's been in place for the last 20 years or so. We added the $35 million on top of it, so we're spending more than we've ever spent on water, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. And we've really only been through 2 full budget cycles at that spending level. And so we haven't been able to take a look and say, okay, we understand we have these problems, but are we actually spending this money wisely? What are we getting for our money? And so I'm not quite as quick to say $140 million solves the problem. Some of that's our work to make sure we have a system where we do put some accountability in place, and I think that's an absolute must before our colleagues will be willing to invest more money. But I don't have any illusions about us going and getting the other $80 million that was recommended in this budget cycle. Leadership has indicated there'll probably be budget cuts this year. So my goal in working with the task force is I would like a reliable source of funding, but what I don't want to do is make a recommendation that we all know is dead on arrival, because then we haven't accomplished anything. So the key is to really work on systematic change so we have a good system in place that when there's money available, people will be comfortable putting it there. And I do think we need to be creative. We can look at different types of fees and things like that to sort of increase that sort of reliable base up to a better number, and then we can supplement it as we go. But I don't want to just, going back to like the sales tax carve-off, my sense of the legislative environment is that will not be well received. So I'd like to, let's be creative, let's spend our time, and let's try and do something that we think will be successful.
Yeah. I have one more question at the, I'll start at the back and then I'll end with you.
Hi. Thank you, all three of you, for your contributions to a great conversation today. My conversation is regarding resources for the types of projects that are anticipated. So you mentioned needing the resource of money and having to go through the policymaking cycle to be able to raise that. My question, I guess, is for what other resources need to be generated? Is it basically we need enough money because of the technical specifications and the technology that's going on, or are there opportunities for normal people like me and like most people in this room that have an ability to help this other than just going to the public participation process?
Yeah, it's a great question. Multi-part. I think the first thing you said, what else, when you first said what else is needed in addition to funding, my mind immediately went to funding staff and doing workforce development. I think, we've talked a lot about, in rural communities in particular, having enough certified operators in order to actually run public water supply and wastewater systems, and having people with the technical expertise around water to be our engineers and to be our operators and to be our our Forest Service and our folks working on conservation and agricultural best practices and things like that. So I think that's a key part of it, but it's a great question in terms of what else can everyone do to help make a difference. It's not just legislation and state level work, but what can we all do to conserve water and move the needle. And I think I get really stuck in the weeds on the policy side, but I think there are also a lot of great local organizations that are involved in water conservation, whether it's Friends of the Caw or Nature Conservancy or Heartland Conservation Alliance, and many others that are doing great work on water in Kansas. And I think connecting with them is a great way to get involved and make a difference. Promoting water conservation practices or learning more about them and what's currently being done with your local municipalities and improving those, I think, is a great way to get involved.
I'll throw out one that I think is
Yes.
low-hanging fruit, if I may, as a
Yes.
farmer. Don't waste food. I think that is one of the largest
Yes.
users of water, is not only agriculture, but processing food and what we eat and how we transport it. So I think that's something that each person can take a lot of responsibility for, either you're buying local, shopping local, and then eat what you buy.
It's a great one. Yeah.
Senator, did you have anything to add for
Education. Be an educated consumer. Know where your water comes from, know where it leaves the city, and make conservation-minded choices. And because if people approach water that way, it helps us as we advocate for these sort of systematic solutions. When people understand how important it is, I think that's the big. If you look at nobody in the United States pays the real cost of water because it's so important. We want it to be available. But if we were actually paying what it costs to deliver water to your house, right, we would all consume it very differently because it would cost so much more. So being an educated consumer, I think, and having awareness really moves the needle as you move up the ladder and get to policy.
I promised the last question up here.
The city of Hayes, a few years ago, I believe, tapped a source someplace near Kinsley, which is not right next door to Hayes. How did that work, and how much did it cost, and who paid?
Start with the attorney on this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, we still don't know how much it will cost at the end of the day. So the cities of Hayes and Russell in the early 90s realized they did not have enough water to meet hardly any future growth. So they went through a whole process and evaluated because they both, neither community is on the Ogallala. Hayes is on the edge, but they don't have access to Ogallala wells, so they have the Smoky Valley alluvium that they can pull some water out of. And they looked at, could we get water? Cedar Bluff doesn't have enough water. Wilson Lake isn't suitable. They even looked at Canopolis, I think, at one point to try and move water. And they basically determined they didn't have any solutions for their geographic area. So what they did was they bought a large ranch down by Kinsley. It was the R9 Ranch. And their intent was eventually to convert, and there were 20 or 30 wells. It was a very large ranch. And they actually turned it into, they do some tenant farming without irrigation, and they've turned some of it into open hunting land. And then the idea was to turn those wells into municipal wells and pipe it about 60 miles up to Hayes, and then another 20 or 30 miles over to Russell from there. So in order to move water that far, at that quantity, you have to go through a special procedure called the Water Transfer Act. In most states, Western states, have something like this. If you go from one basin to another, is usually the line. You have to weigh a whole bunch of factors, and they've gone through all of that process and then now they're waiting on a final decision and some court appeals along the way to get approval to move the water. So in the next couple of years, if they win their court battles, it's likely they would begin construction. But I can't remember the exact numbers on the costs, but it was because they had plans and estimates prior to COVID, and so the way everything has increased since then, it's been a 35 or 40% increase on something like a $19 million project. So, I don't even know what their lawyer fees have been. They would have been good work if you could get it, but it's an ongoing process. So, and the state, the state engineer balances: is this more beneficial to the state or not to move this water, and does it hurt the local users in the area? And there's a panel actually of it's the director of environment, the water office director, and the chief engineer, and they weigh all of this in a hearing and make sure it's equitable. Might be a word you would use to move water that far.
Representative, any final thoughts?
Yes, I love this example because in order to go through this hearing process and to meet the requirements of that, one of the things they had to do was have long-term demonstrated conservation in their community. And that's something that they have achieved. So Hayes, Kansas actually uses the least water per capita of any community, as far as I know, in Kansas. So they have implemented those types of city-level conservation practices and done a really good job at that. And then the other part of that you did ask was the funding and who's paying for it. So I know in Hayes, if I'm not mistaken, they have dedicated part of their local sales tax to this project and to water projects. So part of it will be locally funded. I think they are trying to get federal, state revolving loan fund dollars potentially. And then I think they have applied for some build grants as well. So I think they're attempting to pay for it in multiple ways.
I do think the people that live in Hayes, though, will carry the majority of that. They've been saving pennies for a long time for that project.
Well, thank you both so much. I'm grateful for your time and also for just your dedicated work on this topic. So you'd help me in thanking them. Thank you, everybody.